In the winter of 1999, Whistler Mountain was experiencing the heaviest snowfall of the decade. Skiers and snowboarders braved the slopes as the storm intensified. But when one family, the Martins, decided to take a late-night ski trip, they would encounter a chilling and unexpected presence, one that would follow them through the snow, forever changing their lives. David Martin, an experienced skier, had been on Whistler Mountain several times before. But that night, the storm was more brutal than ever. Visibility was nearly non-existent as they ascended the chairlift. By the time they reached the top, the wind howled and snow was piling up at an alarming rate. "We'll be fine," David assured his wife Sarah and their two children, Emma and Ethan, as they skied down the mountain. But as they neared the bottom, something unusual happened. A figure appeared ahead of them, cloaked in white. At first, they thought it was another skier, but there was something off about it. No skis, no snowboard, and the figure seemed to glide effortlessly over the snow. "Who's that?" Emma asked, pointing. "Just keep skiing," David responded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. But no matter how fast they skied, the figure stayed ahead of them, leading them deeper into the mountain's treacherous terrain. Hours passed, and the snowstorm only worsened. The family found themselves lost, unable to see the familiar ski paths. They were cold, disoriented, and running low on supplies. Then, at the peak of their desperation, the figure appeared again. This time, it was standing still, watching them from a distance. "Who is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't look at it," David urged, but it was too late. The figure began moving toward them, not walking, but floating above the snow. The wind howled louder, and the temperature dropped sharply. The family tried to escape, but no matter where they went, the figure was always just ahead, silently guiding them. Hours turned into an endless nightmare as the ghostly presence hovered over them, whispering incoherent words in the wind. The next morning, after a harrowing night spent trapped in the snow, the Martins were rescued by search teams. They were found near the base of the mountain, their faces pale with fear. When they were interviewed, they mentioned the strange figure they had seen. Search teams later confirmed that no one else was on the mountain that night. Weeks later, the family learned about the legend of a skier who had died on Whistler Mountain decades earlier. A man who was trapped in a blizzard, his body never found. It was said that his spirit now haunted the mountain, forever guiding those lost in the snow, trapping them in the storm with him. To this day, the Martins can't shake the feeling that they were never alone on that mountain, and that the ghostly figure was not just a figment of their imagination, but something far more sinister. Bear Creek Pass in Colorado is known for its beautiful mountain scenery, but it's also infamous for a strange and terrifying legend. According to locals, a ghostly hitchhiker appears during heavy snowstorms, only to vanish once inside the car. Several people have claimed to have encountered her, but no one has ever seen her leave the vehicle. In December 2002, Mike Jensen, a college student traveling home for Christmas, found himself driving through Bear Creek Pass on a snowy evening. The road was barely visible through the thick snow, and the wind whistled through the trees, making the journey feel more dangerous than usual. As Mike drove slowly through the pass, he noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a white coat, her hair blowing wildly in the snow. Despite the storm, she looked strangely calm. Mike pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" The woman nodded silently, stepping into the car. She didn't speak, but her presence was unsettling. Mike noticed her pale skin and the cold air that seemed to surround her. As Mike drove, he attempted to make small talk, but the woman remained eerily quiet. Her eyes stared out the window, and her fingers were pressed against the cold glass. Mike tried to shake off the feeling of unease that crept up his spine. He could feel the temperature in the car drop, despite the heater blasting. "Are you from around here?" Mike asked, his voice shaking slightly. The woman didn't respond. Mike glanced at her again. Her face had become even more pale, and her lips were slightly blue. That's when it hit him. She didn't look like she was breathing. Suddenly, the car lurched forward as though the brakes had been slammed. Mike glanced back at the woman in horror. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was wide open, though the car was still moving forward. Panicking, Mike pulled over and jumped out of the car. He looked around, but there was no sign of the woman. The snowstorm had worsened, and the road was deserted. As he looked back at the car, he noticed something chilling. The passenger seat was still wet with the condensation of her presence, and the temperature had dropped several degrees. Mike never saw the woman again, but he later learned from locals that the road was notorious for such disappearances. They told him the story of a young woman who had died in a snowstorm many years ago, hitchhiking home for Christmas. Her body was never found, and now her spirit haunted the pass, waiting for unsuspecting travelers. The town of Frostbite Hollow, Alaska, had been isolated for weeks due to a heavy snowstorm that blocked all access roads. The residents were used to the harsh winters, but this storm was different. It brought a feeling of unnatural silence. When the storm finally cleared, the town's only remaining survivor, Tom Miller, made a horrifying discovery. Tom had been away on a hunting trip when the storm began. When he returned, he found the streets of Frostbite Hollow eerily quiet. The snow piled up on the houses, but there were no signs of life. The windows were all dark, and the usual sounds of daily life were gone. As he entered his house, Tom called out for his wife and children, but there was no answer. Panic set in as he searched the entire town. He checked each house, each store, and the community center. But every home was empty. The only thing he found were footprints in the snow that led to the edge of the town and disappeared. Confused and terrified, Tom went to the local cemetery where he hoped to find some clue. What he found shocked him. There in the cemetery were dozens of graves that had not been there before. The tombstones were fresh, the names unfamiliar. Tom turned around, his breath visible in the icy air. As he did, he saw them, figures dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces gaunt and pale. They were standing in the snow, motionless, their eyes locked on him. The figures did not speak, but Tom could feel the chill of their presence. They were not alive, but their cold, empty eyes seemed to follow his every movement. Tom eventually learned that the town had been struck by an ancient curse. Every generation, the spirits of those who had died in the harsh winters of Frostbite Hollow returned to claim the living. The town had been trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth, where the souls of the dead were trapped in the snowstorm, never able to escape. It was said that the town was doomed to vanish every winter, only to return with new victims. And as Tom Miller gazed out into the snowstorm, he knew he had become part of the town's twisted legacy. A ghost destined to wander in the cold, never to leave. In the small town of Evergreen, Colorado, there was a legend passed down through generations. A snowman that would come to life in the most brutal snowstorms. While most dismissed it as a local folktale, a group of children would soon discover the terrifying truth. It was Christmas Eve when the storm hit Evergreen. The snow piled up quickly, and the temperature dropped to dangerous levels. That night, a group of children decided to build the biggest snowman ever seen in their small town. They packed the snow tight, sculpting the snowman into a towering figure. But as they finished, something strange happened. The snowman seemed to take on an eerie shape. Its eyes, made of coal, seemed to glimmer, and the smile it formed looked almost too realistic, as if it were grinning at the children. The wind howled around them, and the snowstorm intensified, but the children weren't scared. They thought it was simply the wind playing tricks on them. However, as the last child, Emily, stepped back to admire their creation, she noticed something chilling. The snowman's head had tilted slightly, as if it were looking directly at her. Her heart raced, and she quickly dismissed the thought as her imagination running wild. That night, as the storm raged on, the children went inside to escape the cold. But as they sat around the fireplace, they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They watched through the window as the snowstorm continued, blanketing the world outside in a thick layer of white. And then they saw it. The snowman, which had been stationary all evening, was moving. At first, it was small, just a slight shift in position, but then it began to lurch forward, as if it were walking toward the house. The children stared in disbelief, unsure whether they were seeing things or if something truly supernatural was happening. Suddenly, the snowman's head turned toward the window, its coal eyes glowing in the dim light of the room. The children screamed and rushed to the door, trying to close it, but before they could, the snowman crashed against the glass. its cold, icy hands leaving a dark imprint on the window. Terrified, the children ran to their parents, but when they returned to the front door, the snowman had vanished. The footprints in the snow around the yard were gone, as though it had never been there. But as the children looked out into the storm, they heard a faint whisper carried by the wind. It sounded like a voice calling their names, followed by a deep, menacing laugh. The next morning, when the storm finally stopped, the children went outside to inspect the yard. To their horror, the snowman had returned, larger and more menacing than before. Its grin had widened and its eyes seemed to have changed. They looked darker, more lifelike, as if they were filled with malice. As the children tried to approach, the snowman's smile twisted into a sinister frown, and a shadowy figure emerged from behind it. The figure seemed to be made of snow itself, but it moved with an unnatural grace. It was a tall, dark figure, its face hidden in the shadows. The children fled in terror, but as they ran, the figure's icy hands reached out to grab them, sending a chill that would freeze them to the bone. The snowman and the shadowy figure continued to haunt Evergreen for several more days, always appearing during the worst snowstorms. Local legends say that the snowman is the spirit of a man who died many years ago during a fierce winter storm. He had been trapped in the snow and, in his desperation to survive, created a snowman as a companion. But the snowman, animated by the spirit of the lost soul, became a terrifying creature, forever roaming the stormy winter nights, searching for others to take with him into the snow. After the final encounter, the snowman was never seen again. The storm that followed dissipated, and the children eventually forgot the terror they had witnessed. But some say that on the coldest, snowiest nights, if you look closely enough, you can still see a figure moving through the storm. A figure made of snow, with coal black eyes and a grin that never fades. Lake Michigan has seen its share of strange happenings, but in the winter of 1993, a tragedy turned into a chilling tale that would echo through the generations. It began as a routine fishing trip, but what happened that day would leave the small town of Traverse City forever haunted by the cry of a fisherman lost to the cold. Jim Roberts, a seasoned fisherman, had been out on Lake Michigan for decades. He knew the lake like the back of his hand, and nothing ever scared him. Until that fateful December day. The weather had been unpredictable, but Jim had decided to go out on his boat with his son, Danny, and his best friend, Tom, to catch some late-season fish. As they sailed out onto the lake, the storm began to brew on the horizon. The sky darkened, and the wind picked up. But Jim wasn't worried. He had dealt with worse storms in his time. However, by the time they realized how severe the storm had become, it was too late. The waves grew higher, the wind howled louder, and snow began to fall, obscuring their vision. As the storm worsened, Jim tried to steer the boat back to shore, but the storm had taken control. The boat rocked violently, and at one point it was tossed high into the air, only to slam back down onto the icy water below. During the chaos, Jim was thrown overboard. He disappeared into the icy depths of Lake Michigan, swallowed by the storm. Danny and Tom tried desperately to save him, but they were unable to find him in the churning waves. With no choice but to return to shore, they left the lake, shaken and fearing the worst. When they arrived back, the storm had already caused damage, but it wasn't until the next morning that the full extent of the tragedy became clear. Jim's body was never recovered, and it was assumed that he had drowned in the lake's freezing waters. But that was just the beginning of the terrifying events that followed. For weeks after Jim's disappearance, strange occurrences began to plague the town. Fishermen reported hearing a faint, eerie cry on the coldest, snowiest nights, always coming from the direction of Lake Michigan. It was as if Jim's spirit was still out there, trapped in the icy depths, crying for help. One night, a young couple, Sarah and Mark, decided to go for a late-night walk along the frozen shore of Lake Michigan. They had heard the stories, but they didn't believe them. That is, until they heard the cry. It was a haunting wail, filled with anguish, coming from the middle of the lake. Sarah froze in place, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaky. The cry echoed again, louder this time. They turned to leave, but before they could move, the ice beneath them creaked and groaned. A figure appeared on the frozen lake, walking toward them with a slow, deliberate pace. It was a man, drenched in water, his clothes heavy with snow and ice. His face was pale, his eyes wide open with a haunting expression of fear. The figure reached out to them, and Sarah screamed, pulling Mark away. As they ran, the figure vanished into the snowstorm, leaving only the sound of his cry lingering in the air. To this day, Jim Roberts' spirit is said to haunt Lake Michigan, forever trapped in the snowstorm that claimed his life. The cry of the frozen fisherman can still be heard on cold winter nights, carried across the ice by the wind. It serves as a reminder of the dangers of the lake, the storm that never truly ended, and the souls that are lost to the frozen depths.